I am the Associate Director for the John Brown House Museum, and we're so excited that you're here for tonight's book talk, Spark of Independence, the American Revolution in the Northern Colonies, 1775 to 1776, with Michael Cecere. I'd like to thank our partners and our event sponsor, the Battle of Rhode Island Association. Without their support, this program would not be possible. This evening, we're thrilled to host Michael Cecere, who's a retired history teacher from Williamsburg, Virginia. He has written more than 25 books and articles about the American Revolution, and he works as a historic interpreter at Colonial Williamsburg. Spark of Independence is his third and final book in the Independence trilogy, which is available in our gift shop this evening. Just FYI, if you don't have a copy already. And the book explores the question, or the series explores the question, what happened in the 13 colonies after bloodshed erupted in April 1775 at Lexington and Concord, until independence was declared in July 1776. During tonight's talk, Cecere will discuss the reaction of the American colonies to the outbreak of war in Massachusetts in 1775. He will highlight key events that occurred 250 years ago with an emphasis on Rhode Island. So please join me in welcoming Michael Cecere.
Thank you everyone. Just a tiny bookkeeping thing, sorry to throw you under the bus, Elizabeth. We never talked about my last name. And so it's okay, it's okay. Well, I've been saying it wrong. If you ask an Italian, they say that my name is supposed to be pronounced Cecere or Cecere or something like that. My dad taught me years ago to say Cecere, but having taught for 30 years, I get what you call it, yours, and a lot of other interpretations, so it's no big deal. But my name is Michael Cecere, for the record. Thank you again for being here. It's a wonderful site. I'm so excited to be here. I got a great tour and enjoyed it very much, learned a lot. And now we're here to talk about the Revolution, which is my favorite topic. I've been kind of immersed in it for a quarter of a century now. And this book that we're kind of basing it on, the third of the three that I wrote on the early part of the war, was not supposed to happen. What originally happened is I decided I wanted to explore outside of Virginia because I'm from Maine originally, but I moved to Virginia in 1990, raised a family there, had a career in education there, have retired to Williamsburg where I do a little part-time work with them. And also, I am kind of an adopted Virginian, and I know Virginia very, very well, but I didn't know the Carolinas as well as I wanted, or Georgia. And so my first book of the three that we talk about was called March to Independence, and I basically wanted to know, well, what else happened in the South besides all the things that happened in Virginia in the early part of the war? Well, then the publisher said, that's great, now do another one on the Middle Colonies. And I was like, oh, Bruce, that is way outside my comfort zone. I haven't done anything on the Middle Colonies. But I rolled up my sleeves and I did a Middle Colony one. And then he said again, now the New England, he called them Northern Colonies. And I was like, but Bruce, you do understand the whole reason I did the first one was because of all the attention that Massachusetts gets in 1775. So how in the world can I write a book about New England when everyone knows the story of Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill already, and there are great authors that have written about that, so what am I going to do? Well, I came up with one idea, didn't work, another idea didn't work, and I stuck to the format, and I looked at New England, the 4 colonies that made up New England at the time, and I looked for the things that fly under the radar. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight, including what happened here in Rhode Island, as well as other events. So the idea of the conflict spreads, we are going to talk about all the colonies, all 13 colonies, but I'm going to emphasize Rhode Island, of course. Now, our starting point for this then is April 19th, 1775. That's a doodle etching, painting of the British in Concord. And of course, what I was really curious to know is how did all the other colonies react when they heard the news? The news took a while. It took 10 days for the news of Lexington and Concord to reach Williamsburg, Virginia. So, and in between that, it stopped off at all the other colonies, and then it took even longer to get deeper in the South. So, but everybody had the same reaction. They were outraged. They were angry. Let's look at Rhode Island. Rhode Island, basically, almost immediately, you had people marching to join until they were turned around saying, it's all over. They're back in Boston. We don't need you to join us now. But in Rhode Island, the assembly was still meeting. Rhode Island and Connecticut maintained their governments during this time period, where so many other governments had been dissolved by royal governors and such. And so the assembly authorizes 1,500 men to form or join an army of observation that Massachusetts called for. And so the New England colonies are all kind of teaming together to contribute to this. And so Rhode Island's portion is going to be 1,500 men in 3 regiments. Now this part blows me away. I cannot for the life of me still understand how Nathaniel Greene is placed in command. And I don't mean that as a slur on him, because I admire him greatly. I reenact a lot of battles in which he commanded. I think he was an outstanding commander. So thank you. He's a great choice. But I don't know if you're all familiar with the story of General Greene and all. He's living down in Coventry. And in 73, I want to say, 73 is the Tea Party. So in 74, I think he and some of his associates, they decide to form what we in Virginia would call an independent militia company or a volunteer militia company. Washington was involved in this himself. George Mason was involved in this in Fairfax County. The idea is just to be prepared. So he helps form this thing. And then his own cohorts say, well, we don't want you to be an officer in it because we're kind of embarrassed because you kind of walk with a limp. They literally say that. Everything I've read confirms that he was kind of passed over, and he even talks about how hurt he was. He didn't realize that his little infirmary there was such an issue to some. He thinks about resigning from the company, but he stays on as a private. So he's a private in the Kent Guards, I think they're called, right? And then this happens, and the next thing you know, he's brigadier general of all three regiments. How does that happen? I believe that maybe, obviously he's a man of means. He's got a mill, iron mill, and it's a prominent family already, but he doesn't have any experience. Most of the people, and I've written a lot of biographies on officers, they tend to, if you're going to be a general, typically you were in the French and Indian War, or you have some experience along those lines. He didn't have any war experience. He had very little militia experience, but apparently people recognize his genius. He's just a smart guy. And, I'm still not totally satisfied with that explanation. There's got to be another reason why he jumped over Varnum and some of the others. But there he is. He is the brigadier general. Now, this was an interesting situation too. Rhode Island the assembly had just reelected Joseph Wanton as governor, but he was too loyalist to their liking now in this situation, because you got to remember there's before Lexington and Concord and then after Lexington and Concord, and things change because of Lexington and Concord. And so they basically sabotage Governor Wanton, and they never swear him in. And they bypassed him, and so Nicholas Cook he's the lieutenant governor. He becomes the governor, the chief executive, in fact, and he's in charge. And you see all these letters between Washington and Cook. And Wanton is just kind of pushed aside. He never gets sworn in to serve his next term of office. Now, here's what's going on. Even before the war broke out in 75, you have a couple of British warships anchored off of Newport. And this is going to be a continuing story throughout this time period. Newport has got kind of like Damocles' sword hanging over them during this whole time. The Rose is a 20-gun ship, a large crew. The Swan's a little smaller. And they've been threatening the town ever since December of 74. They showed up within days of the removal of gunpowder from a fort off of Newport. They just missed that. And now they're there. They're just kind of lingering around and as a threat. Now, their officers, even once the war breaks out, their officers continue to go to shore and have dinner with prominent Tories in Newport. So just imagine, I've raised an army of 1,500 men, plenty of volunteers. They're getting ready to go and march to Massachusetts to join in the siege of the British Army in Boston. Meanwhile, Captain Wallace is having dinner down the street in Newport with a prominent Tory. It's just a weird kind of mix there. All right, so these are a couple of period maps that I, being not a Rhode Islander, had to get used to a little bit. What is the island? But sometimes it's known as Rhode Island, which really confuses things because all of this is Rhode Island too, to a lot of people. And this is Jamestown Island. I believe, and this is Prudence, I believe, too, and I know Bristol's right there. This is Newport. So today I was walking around these streets here. These are some maps. Sorry, Providence, I don't have a great map of you yet. So Rhode Island's troops get organized in May. There's a little bit of a delay because they were a little slow in appointing the actual regimental officers, but they get that done. And so they march off in late May, and they arrive in late May and early June. Now, General Greene has already been up there, reported, and then comes back to help with the recruitment, and then he goes back in early June. And when he gets there, he finds that his men are very discouraged and ready to walk. They have clubbed them, he even says it, they've clubbed their muskets, which is what you do when you're surrendering usually, or you're getting ready to walk off the field. And so what he does is he gets there and does what he does best. He gets things fixed. He's a great quartermaster general in the middle of the war, and he gets things better, settled. So now the men are better supplied. They're not as frustrated. Everything calms down, and they take their position in the lines outside of Boston. I think I have it. Yeah, there we go. I have a picture of Boston here. So this is Cambridge, where Harvard is today, of course, and this is Boston back then, and this is Roxbury, and Greene was at one point posted over by Roxbury, and then he may have taken a position somewhere over here or over there. These are some of the fortifications that they built. But it's all part of the siege. And this, of course, is Bunker Charlestown Peninsula. That's Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill. But this is where the battle's going to be that we'll talk about a little bit later. Okay, let's talk quickly because the idea is to talk about what happened in Rhode Island, but also what's going on in 1775 elsewhere. You know that in May, Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen wake up the British commander in Fort Ticonderoga because the front gate is open and there's only a 50-man garrison there, and nobody is on alert in the middle of the New York wilderness in early May when these guys come in and say, the fort is ours. All right, so they're essentially prisoners in a sense, and it's the ordnance, it's the cannon and the gunpowder that's there. Now, here's really something very interesting. By the end of May, so we're talking about 6 weeks after Lexington and Concord, your first royal governor flees, and he is from North Carolina. In New Bern, which by the way was in the news just yesterday for the flooding that's happening. He flees the capital, sends his family back to England because he's worried about being snatched. And you don't expect North Carolina to be as kind of hot and heavy about rebellion as, say, Massachusetts or even Rhode Island for that matter. Now, this was an interesting thing. In early June, a near Boston massacre occurred in Newport, but it didn't. What happened is this. The British Army's in Boston, and they've been in Boston since June of 1774, and they need provisions. And so there are British transport ships that come to Newport to load up on provisions that come into this very busy town, and it's creating a food shortage in town. And this gentleman named George Rome has purchased 80 barrels of recently arrived flour. And when the public hears about this, they get very upset. They think that there's not going to be any left for them because it's all being shipped up to Boston, which, by the way, the Continental Congress called for a ban on that kind of thing. So you should not be doing that. There's a non-importation, non-exportation agreement among all the true patriots. And so right here's a quote from the Reverend Stiles, who was living there. The patience of the people was exhausted. A body arose and demanded the flour. Rome at first promised to deliver it up, but Captain Wallace soon landed about 100 Marines and sailors, armed, and stationed them around Rome's house and stores to protect him, upon which the people beat to arms, and about 90 resolute men appeared under arms. There was the utmost danger of hostilities and a bloody scene. Now, this is early June 1775. No bloodshed in Rhode Island yet. No Rhode Islander has been involved in a battle to speak of. And so you've got this kind of standoff. This is Captain Wallace of the HMS Rose. He's the ranking naval officer here. He says, an insurrection happened here. The people took it in their heads. A merchant had bought some provisions for the use of government, meaning the British. They stopped the carts, threw about the flour, flew to arms with an avowed intent to destroy the merchant's house and stores, crying out through the streets, now was the time to kill the Tories. I went on shore, saw the rebels coming in shoals, armed with muskets, bayonets, sticks, stones, and I got 100 men or more ashore, well armed, stopped them, told them upon the first act of hostility we would rush on and put every man to the sword, and at the same time order the ships to fire the town in every quarter. He had 2 warships offshore. This, together with the prayers and entreaties of several of their principal men, probably including Reverend Stiles, put a stop to the affair wherein the lives of hundreds were concerned. So it was a near miss. It was a tense situation, but in the end, nobody died. They dodged a bullet. 4 days later, in New York, this comical scene happens. There are 100 redcoats still stationed in New York in early June. They're posted in New York in a barracks. And the HMS Asia, a 64-gun warship, has shown up. And Major Hamilton, who's in charge, not Alexander, of course, who's in charge of these redcoats, says, I need to get out of this town. It's very hostile, and these guys keep trying to encourage my men to desert. So he makes arrangements to move his 100 men down the street from the barracks onto the Asia, right? And the city magistrates approve this, so everything's good. So they're marching down Broadway, heading toward the battery where the ship is anchored, and a crowd forms led by Marinus Willett. And they basically stop them and say, whoa, we said you and your men could leave, but those baggage wagons you're carrying with those extra arms, they can't go. They're staying. And the major's standing there going, that's the king's property. You can't do it. And Willett and his crowd just take the carts and they start steering them off into the alleys. And Willett's got to make a decision right then. Do I resist or do I march on? And has anybody ever seen the Steve McQueen movie, the Sand Pebble? The Sand Pebble from China? Oh, it's such a great movie. And there's a scene where the American Navy basically is in China and the Boxer Rebellion's going on, and all of a sudden the commander is facing the American commander is facing the exact same thing. Do I react to all this hostility and shoot some people, or do I march on? Well, both of them marched on. No, the British let those things go and they marched on, humiliated. And Major Hamilton will talk about how frustrated and angry he was. But this is a surprise to some people that this kind of sentiment is in New York City. The very next day, totally unconnected, another royal governor falls. Lord Dunmore, the governor of Virginia, flees Williamsburg. That's the governor's palace, where, by the way, I will be dancing on Friday in a program. And so Governor Dunmore flees with his family, and he's going to still be around. He sends his family to England, but he stays around. And then within a month, we'll be fighting another battle that he was involved with in Virginia. Meanwhile, Congress takes charge of the army. It's now middle of June, and they authorize the Continental Congress. Here's what they do. They basically say, the troops outside of Boston are now under Continental establishment. George Washington of Virginia will be their commander, and then they appoint major generals and brigadier generals. And they authorize an attack on Canada. And because they've been told by Benedict Arnold and others up there that the British are getting ready to attack us. So Congress says, okay, fine. You go there and strike them first before they get too strong and stop this from happening. So there's authorization for an attack on Canada in June 2. All right, let me tell you really quickly this story. This is June now 11 and 12, 1775. One of the first naval engagements. It happens off the coast of Maine, way up there on the coast of Maine. I grew up right there. That's Bar Harbor right over there. That's Mount Desert Island. But Machias is another hour and a half away. And what happened is this. These people living in this town, that's what Mount Charles looks like today. I took that picture there, and that's pretty much the town. There was let me go back. There was a waterfall, you can see it right there, and a sawmill, and that's what Machias made his living on. They basically cut wood and made timber, lumber, and firewood, and then they sold most of that to Boston. Well, guess what? Now with the Congress banning all trade with those British soldiers in Boston, these people have no economy. And they went through a tough winter, and they're running out of food. And they literally write to their government, which, by the way, this is Massachusetts, remember, not Maine, because they were still part of Massachusetts, and they're begging for help. And then this gentleman, within days of that, just by chance, this gentleman, Ichabod Jones, comes in with 2 sloops full of provisions to trade, because he knows the British need firewood and lumber in Boston, and so he has food, and he's going to make a trade with them. And there's a small little British, they called tenders, that escorted them just in case. And so what happens is the town is split. We're starving, what do? Half of them decide to take the deal. The other half grumbles about it. Then the other half tries to capture the British commander of the little tender when he goes to church with Ichabod Jones. They don't get him, but they get Ichabod Jones. The British commander now decides, okay, what am I going to do? And he decides, I'm got to leave. There's nothing. They've already struck, so he decides to leave. And this is where it gets crazy, because the Machias guys decide, we're not done yet. We're not done. And look at this quote. Our people, seeing the Margaretta, that was the British tender that was supposedly escorting Jones and protecting his 2 ships, which, by the way, have been seized. Seeing the Margaretta go off in the morning, the next day, determined to follow her, about 40 men armed with ready guns, swords, axe, and pitchforks, are going to go up against this British warship. Now, granted, it wasn't a very powerful ship, but off they go, and this is what it looked like. And those 2 vessels caught up with the Margaretta before they reached the open sea, and they overpowered them. And people died. People died here on both sides, including Midshipman Moore, who was in charge of the British Margaretta. He died the next day of his wounds. Now, on that same day, it just so happens, Rhode Island has basically authorized a committee of safety. It gives permission to the Committee of Safety to man out 2 ships, because we need, Rhode Island saying this, we need protection ourselves. Again, unrelated to what's going on in Machias. They have no idea what's going on in Machias. So 2 suitable vessels to basically become, in a sense, a colonial navy, or a state navy, I should say. The Rose, by the way, had converted several other vessels. This is the HMS Rose, the British warship, had started seizing, because this is economic war. Any ship that is now caught on the high seas or in the Narragansett Bay and all that is going to be boarded and most times seized. And so Captain Wallace is taking some of his crew and then turning these smaller vessels that are getting captured into small warships, because they can get into places that his bigger warship can't get into. So he's trying to strangle all commerce in Rhode Island, okay? And that leads to our first clash in Rhode Island. An armed privateer, not necessarily one of those 2 suitable vessels that the colony had called for official navy, but this is just some, I don't know who, I can't remember who it was in particular, but he had armed with 6 cannon and a number of men, confronted one of the tenders, one of the lightly armed and manned tenders under the British flag now, somewhere off of Rhode Island, the island of Rhode Island. And this is the account. This is the account from the commander who was in charge at the time. They hailed us and told us to bring to, or she would sink us. This is the privateer would sink us immediately, and directly fired a shot, which we returned with our small arms and swivels. Now, a swivel is like a little mini cannon, which tells me they didn't even have 3-pound cannon, which is your smallest carriage cannon. So swivels are really meant to clear decks and such, and small arms are muskets and all that. And kept a smart fire on both sides for near half an hour. So in Narragansett Bay, you've got this raging fight for a half an hour between guys with muskets and swivels. And then a lucky shot from the privateer nailed the ammunition chest. The ammunition for the small arms being nearly expended, and another armed vessel with carriage guns, bigger cannon, belonging to the rebels, joining and bringing us between 2 fires. Now we're caught between 2. This officer decided to beach the vessel and abandon it, okay? And so that's what happened. Captain Wallace confirms this, basically says when Captain Wallace heard of this, he leaves 5 transports that are loading up with food to go and investigate. And then the people in Newport take the opportunity to raid those vessels and sack them. And so basically Wallace is of the mind. This is why I use this slide, this quote right, sorry, pushed the wrong one. This quote right here. Basically he says, listen, Admiral, what's going on in Rhode Island demonstrate that the people in Rhode Island are as much in rebellion as Israel Putnam and his camp. Okay, and of course Putnam is already famous for racing up to Massachusetts as soon as he heard about Lexington and Concord. Now comes the Kingfisher with 16 guns. Now Captain Wallace is harassing. Why haven't we heard as much about all this? Because what happens just a few days later, there, Bunker Hill, Okay, the Battle of Bunker Hill takes all the oxygen out of the room. Okay, the famous pile painting there. 1,000 redcoats fall that day. Not all of them die, of course, but many of them do. Okay, meanwhile, back in Rhode Island, it looks like Newport's about to get bombarded in July, but and I think the cause of that was a couple of deserters had fled to the, had gone ashore and basically were hiding out. But in the end, Wallace did not bombard that. I want to go and jump down to the end of the summer, and this story. The Asia, that same ship where those British soldiers went to in June, is sitting offshore in August, and there are a whole bunch of cannon at what they today call the battery. And those are the King's cannon, and so no one's to touch them. Well, Captain Lamb, John Lamb, an artillerist from New York, and a company of men decide to move those cannon deeper into the city. Now, the British captain is aware of this because there are loyalists in the town, and he's got a little boat, like a longboat with some sailors listening, and their job is to fire a shot if they hear any attempt to take the cannon. So on August 23rd, sure enough, bam, they can see movement. They're trying to steal the cannon. They fire their warning shot. The men on shore hear the shot. They think they're being fired on. They fire into the darkness toward where the shot came. They hit a sailor. The boat now has done its job. It's just rowing back to the Asia. What's going on? What's happening? What's happening? They fired on us. Well, by God, we won't have that. So they fire a couple of cannon shot into the town. Now the city's awake. The drums are beating. The men are rushing. It looks the whole, hornet's nest is brought up. And so what Asia does is blast a whole broadside. Now you're a 64-gun ship. That means you've got 30 or more cannon on one side of your vessel blasting right into New York. Fraunces Tavern. You guys ever heard of Fraunces Tavern? I was lucky enough to be there last month, and one of those cannonballs landed right in the roof of that. It's just a couple of blocks from the shore. So you've got this going on in New York City. In Virginia, this is going to be kind of rapid fire. Now, in Virginia, it's August and then early September. They're getting serious about it now. Now, they started out with give me liberty or give me death a few weeks before. That's Patrick Henry a few weeks before Lexington and Concord. And since then, and all they got out of that was basically volunteer companies. Now by August, they're creating regiments of regulars. Now let's make sure we understand. You've got militia, you've got Minutemen, who tend to be the more active militia, but they're still militia. And now you've got regulars. Now regulars are full-time soldiers. We haven't had regulars up until since the French and Indian War. George Washington was a regular during that time period, during that conflict 20 years earlier. Now Virginia is raising regulars, just like the troops I already mentioned that joined the Army of Observation from Rhode Island. They're regulars under General Greene. Those guys are regulars too. So Virginia is creating 2 regiments of regulars and battalions of Minutemen. There's a small little contingent of redcoats there to help Lord Dunmore, who I said he fled, but he fled to a British warship. And he's basically offshore stewing, trying to figure out how to get his job back. North Carolina takes advantage of an offer from the Continental Congress, and they raise 2 regiments of regulars. They start printing paper money to pay for it. Also battalions of Minutemen. South Carolina sending ships to the West Indies, the Caribbean, to get more gunpowder. They're raising regiments. So what I'm trying to say here is this. This war, which has really been confined to New England, Massachusetts particularly, and then New England, is spreading. Preparations are spreading all over. All right. Now we get to the fall. I'm only going to cover through the winter of 75, 76. We get to the fall. General Schuyler, who is one of the major generals appointed by the Continental Congress that summer, has 1,200 troops, and he marches toward Canada. Richard Montgomery is a former British officer. He's a brigadier general, and he's going to be in command, really active command. Their objective is to capture a fort called St. John's, then capture Montreal, then capture Quebec. At the same time, Washington joins in late to the game, but decides, I've got the men, I can help out. So he sends Colonel Benedict Arnold to Quebec through Maine in order to be either a distraction or just more pressure. It's a pincer movement. It's a classic pincer movement. Schuyler's going up this way. Arnold, there's Boston. His men march to Newburyport. They sail up to the Kennebec, and then they go all the way up this way. 2 days ago, I was there doing what we call the Great Carrying Place, right there. I was reenacting that. It's a pretty rugged area there. All right, this is a close-up of Montgomery's march. Again, there's Montreal, and St. John's is the key. That's where most of the British force is going to be. And if you can get them, pretty much Canada is wide open. So a siege begins on that fort in September. It lasts all the way to November. 600 Crown forces, Canadian militia and Indians, plus 400 redcoats, the bulk of the British force in Canada, are in this fort. Montgomery struggles and struggles. I don't have the time to get into the details of what he goes through, but luckily on October 18th, the anniversary coming up, a smaller fort with more ammunition is captured from the British, and that keeps the American siege going. The British try to relieve their fort in the end of October. They send reinforcements from Montreal, everything they could scrape together, but they don't make it. They get repulsed. And so they go back to Montreal, and St. John's surrenders on November 3rd. That's the bulk of the British force in Canada surrenders to General Montgomery. That means now the governor of Canada abandons Montreal, and basically, look at this. So there's Montreal, which is on an island. They sail down here, and when they get to there, they can't go any further because there's a battery of American cannon blocking the way, and they're afraid of the destruction it'll cause. And so what happens is all those remaining redcoats and men, including a general, I think William Prescott, is captured. I might be wrong about the William part, but General Prescott is captured here. Now, Governor Carleton does manage to get by with a handful of associates, and they make it all the way to Quebec. But again, now Montreal is wide open. We're capturing Canada. The only thing left is Quebec. So that's 75 in the fall. The war is definitely spreading out. Meanwhile, by the way, Arnold and his guys are struggling in October and November to get, it's Richard Prescott, are struggling to get to Quebec for the next phase of that fight to capture that city. That's the key. Meanwhile, let's take a pause. How are we doing? You guys okay? Everybody good? 6 o'clock. We started at 5:30, right? You said it's 6 now? Good. Let me take a drink. Any questions or anything? Any clarification? Yeah.
Mainly interested in Rhode Island. There's this theory that Rhode Islanders weren't really that involved and willing to cooperate with other colonies. Have you found that?
Yes and no. I know Newport, and we're going to get into a lot of that coming right up in the Newport situation. But there were Rhode Islanders with Arnold, Christopher Green, the famous Christopher Green there that ends up dying at Fort Mercer. But he's leading Rhode Islanders through Arnold's March. And if you guys don't know about Arnold's March, you've got to check it out. You've got to read a little bit about it. It's an epic march. I don't know why there hasn't been it's Benedict Arnold, that's why. But there should be a movie about that march, because you've got all kinds of amazing characters involved. Aaron Burr, Daniel Morgan, Henry Dearborn. These guys are who's who of the Revolution. And what they go through is just amazing. All right.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Who was Carleton?
Guy Carleton is the British commander of Canada. He's a governor of Canada, which would have been the 14th colony. You could say Florida could have been the 15th colony. At the time, that's the way they thought of it. The idea of 13 colonies is something that we create kind of afterwards. Canada was that close to being under our control for a little bit. Whether we could have held it or not, I doubt. But yeah, we almost took Canada then. Okay, so this is just kind of a collage of look what else is going on. South Carolina, another governor flees. Governor Tryon in New York flees. New Jersey now raises 2 regiments of Continentals. Pennsylvania raises 1 regiment. The Quaker state raises a regiment of Continentals. They've already added the riflemen I forgot to mention. Both Pennsylvania and Virginia and Maryland sent riflemen from the frontiers to Boston earlier in the year, in June, July. Now, here in Rhode Island, well, first I should say Admiral Graves in Boston sends a message to Captain Wallace in Rhode Island saying, you are to use every means in your power to burn, sink, and destroy all and every pirate or rebel you meet in arms. This is here in Rhode Island now. Whether onshore or at sea, and you are to do your utmost to lay waste and destroy every town or place from whence pirates are fitted out, or shall presume to harbor or shelter them. Because there's, you know, I'm telling you, when he writes this, he's thinking Machias. But he's also thinking of the guys over in Massachusetts there in the whaleboats. It was Dartmouth, I think it was in Dartmouth. And now, of course, now he's also thinking about what's going on in Rhode Island. And what is going on in Rhode Island? Well, in October, armed with those instructions, militia, a large militia force under Ezek Hopkins, is that the name? Ezek Hopkins, yep. Comes down, oh, I keep pushing the wrong button, I'm sorry. Comes onto this island, there's Newport down there, and basically Wallace insists that force leave or he's going to destroy Newport. That's the gist of what that slide's about. So you've got this little standoff there. In part, why does he go down? Because Wallace is doing what he's also instructed to do: gather up as much provision as you can, the sheep, the cattle, the straw, because you know it's October, so we're getting ready for winter too. So we need to gather forage, and those men are doing that, and then those militia come down and interfere. They come down to this portion, and there's some interference, and now Wallace is demanding that they disperse, they leave the island, or he's going to destroy Newport, okay? Instead, they don't leave the island, they just go further inland, away from the town itself. And for some reason, and I think it might have to do with those dinners I told you about, Wallace basically does not carry through with this threat and bombards Newport. He goes up and bombards Bristol, poor Bristol, because he hasn't had dinner in Bristol, I think. But I think he thinks there's a lot of loyalist people he does not want to punish. And so there's a little fight on October 7th off of Bristol, which is bombarded. Now, the way this story goes, well, I'm going to let the observers tell you about it right here. This is one observation of what happened. The whole fleet began a most heavy cannonading and a bomb vessel to bombard and heave shells and carcasses. Carcasses are things that are meant to create fire and things. They kind of like mortars. You're heaving them in there. Such an incessant and hot fire, the streets being full of men, women, and children. The whole time, the shrieks of the women, the cries of the children, the groans of the sick would have extorted a tear from even the eye of Nero. Words cannot describe this dreadful scene. Now that's going on right up there, right in Bristol, not in Newport. Now, Captain Wallace explained why he did it. He said, look, I asked them, the leaders of that town, to meet with me so I could put in my requisition, which was I need fresh provision. And they ignored me. They refused to come on board my ship. Therefore, this is what you get. If you had only done what I had asked, I wouldn't have bombarded your town. Now let's take a pause for a second and explain something here. It has been a long-standing tradition and expectation that if a British warship pulls into a British colony, that you will trade with them. You will provide them with water and fresh provisions and that sort of stuff. And they'll pay for it. They'll pay for that. And they have been paying for this from Newport, from whoever dares to sell it to them. But most people are not selling these things anymore because of the pressure of the Congress's decision not to trade with the British. And so they don't want to get tarred and feathered or worse if they get caught. So now the British are like, fine, we're just going to take him. We're just going to take the stuff. And that's what they end up doing in Bristol. Bristol actually shows up the next day. The leaders show up the next day and say, well, we can't find 200 sheep, but will you take 50? And they do. They take 50 sheep and other provision. And that's what's going on. And still, poor Newport's still in this situation where, if we don't cave into these demands, then this could happen to us. By the way, there was one gentleman who reportedly died, a John Burt, who apparently had a heart attack during this attack. It was so terrifying because it was a 2-hour bombardment. But he was not, harmed physically from any shot that anyone could tell. He just dropped dead near his house. All right, and there you go. They provide the provision and sheep, and then off he goes to Newport again. Now, Newport, because of their dicey situation with the warships right here, the Rhode Island Assembly, the government, allows Newport to provide the provision that is demanded. Okay, that's interesting. But you know what else? Same thing's happening in New York, and it's going to continue to happen in New York City until Washington shows up there in the spring of 1776 and puts a stop to it. So you get this, even in Virginia, a British captain will come sail into Virginia, and he's like, hey, I need food and water. How come you guys aren't offering any? And he's almost clueless. He's like, I don't understand why you're not offering. It's like, have you been reading the newspapers? Don't you know what's going on? We're kind of at war with you. Speaking of that, in Falmouth, which is Portland, Maine, something very similar to what happened in Bristol happened. 5 warships show up on October 17th and blast this town for a full day and burn 2/3 of it to the ground. This is the kind of stuff that's written in the Declaration of Independence about bombing and burning our towns. The same thing is threat. I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to. That's an eyewitness account. I love eyewitness accounts, but this is the one about just. It's kind of the same thing as Bristol. Everybody's screaming and scared. The town did not put up much of a fight, and that's on them. That's their own fault. So Reverend Bailey is the one that's a great source for. 24 hours before we were in tranquility and living in nice homes, and now it's all destroyed, and winter's coming on, and we are in trouble. That's basically what he says. Now, the same thing almost happens in Hampton. The difference in Hampton is that when the British 5 vessels that just try to go and destroy Hampton, which is on Hampton Roads and the Chesapeake, where the Chesapeake Bay and the James River meet, they get stuck right here because these guys have sunk a vessel in the channel. And then what happens is, as the British sailors try to get through this obstacle, the Virginians start shooting at them from shore. These are the first shots in Virginia of the war. October 26, 6 months after Lexington conquered, now the war is in Virginia. There were Virginians already up in Boston, the riflemen, so they've been at the war, but now the war is happening in Virginia here. The nightfall causes a halt. The next day, those ships make it through. They're right here, but more Virginians have come down, and there's a ship, we call it a ship-to-shore fight, and in the end, Hampton is saved by the Virginians who resist, and the British don't get an opportunity to land and burn it, and they don't have the high power that the ones up in Falmouth had to destroy it by cannon fire. So Hampton survives. Okay, we're flying now. Now we're in November. There's fighting in Charleston Harbor, again, over an obstructed channel. There's fighting at Kemp's Landing. Why is this important? Right here, we talked about this earlier. Lord Dunmore, who's trying desperately to form a force to resist the rebels, or the shirtmen as he calls them, the rebels, basically wins a little skirmish with the handful of redcoats that he has, and then he offers freedom to any enslaved person of a rebel, not of a loyalist, of a rebel who comes and fights for them. So that means no ladies, no children, but I will free every man, enslaved man of a rebel who comes to me and fights. And then he reports later, hundreds answer the call. Thousands flee, hundreds of men will come and try to join his forces. He didn't have enough weapons for them. But that all, meanwhile, in South Carolina, you've got a fight for 3 days down at a place called 96. There's 2 of them. General Greene of Rhode Island is going to be at 96 in June of 1781, May and June, but this is November of 1775. There's not an Englishman here. Well, check that. They're all Englishmen because they're all English colonists. But these are all Carolinians fighting against each other, loyalists and patriots and all that. And then this one ends in a draw. They both agree to kind of stop, but people have been killed here. Then there's the big battle at Great Bridge. We're almost done. The Battle of Great Bridge. This is the battle that William Woodford, the colonel of Virginia forces, says was Bunker Hill, a mini Bunker Hill, except we won. And in this battle, Lord Dunmore is trying to keep this road open and prevent the Americans from seizing the Great Bridge, which goes into the Great Dismal Swamp. It's pretty much the only land route to Norfolk, and he wants to make Norfolk his base of operation. Now, guys, if he can do that, that changes everything. It changes everything. Because now if he stays in Virginia longer than he does, because he wins here, that means there are no Virginians that go north to reinforce the army. There are no Virginians at Trenton and Princeton when they make a really important part of that army at that time. And so what happens at Great Bridge is the 100 or so redcoats that he has get thrown against this basically this breastwork, and they get wiped out. It's a bad move on Dunmore's part or the Redcoats' part. It's a big rebel victory in Virginia that gets overlooked because it's a rather small battle. Also, at the very end of the year, we almost capture Quebec. It's quite a fight in a blizzard. Again, you could write a whole book just on the attack on Quebec. Remember I mentioned Richard Montgomery? He gets shot right in the head with a one cannon blast. That's pretty much all that was fired over here, but it takes out the leadership core of this column of Americans, and it causes the other ones to give up. Benedict Arnold, Daniel Morgan, all these other great heroes, dang it, I looked right at it too. They're coming on this side. Arnold gets shot in the leg, has to go to the rear. They have to overcome 2 barriers to then attack the main town. They overcome the first barrier without Arnold, and then they hesitate because they don't know these guys aren't coming. They were supposed to meet at the second barrier, but they delay, and as a result, the French that are mostly there, there aren't that many redcoats, and the French militia basically rally with the British that are really in charge, and they capture most of Arnold's force. So that's a big fall. The last thing to talk about, back to Rhode Island. January 12th, 1776. Prudence Island, I had to look it up. I wasn't sure which one it was. I got it mixed down with Jamestown. Apparently British foraging parties are spotted out there, and so the militia go and try to interfere with that. So this is Captain Wallace reporting what happened on January 12th. The rebels have for some time past kept from 100 or 200 men on this island to prevent our supplies, and by a law making it death for anyone to supply us, have put us to a great inconvenience. Being much in want of hay, I stood up the bay with the Glasgow, Swan, and some tenders, smaller ships, in order to procure the hay. At about noon, being abreast of Prudence Island, we saw a body of armed men with a field piece, a cannon, who followed us as we sailed along. At the south end of the island, I saw a quantity of hay and determined to land and seize it. All right, so you guys know where we're talking about, right here, right? So this is where this fight's going to be. This, the rebels, perceived and set fire to the stacks and retired to their stone fences to oppose us. We landed and beat them from fence to fence for 4 miles into their country, firing and wasting the country as we advanced along, meaning we burned anything we could find, anybody's house and all that. We burned 12 to 15 farmhouses, took a great deal of stocks, cattle probably, and horses. Probably not horses, but cattle and sheep. When night coming on, we gave over the pursuit and retired back to our ships. So Captain Waller said 3 men were slightly wounded. The rebels, he claimed, suffered several killed and wounded. So in terms of the size of the fight, it's not a huge battle, but guys, that's a Rhode Island battle that most people aren't even aware of, all right? Here's a newspaper account from, I think, the Newport Gazette or Newport Mercury, I want to say. About 9 o'clock in the morning, the enemy landed 250 men and attacked Lieutenant Carr. Now we know who was leading the Americans, who was stationed with about 40 men to observe their motions. The remainder of our men, about 50 in number, soon coming up, a smart engagement ensued which lasted 3 hours. The enemy several times sent out flanking parties, which were so often drove back to the main body. Captain Wallace acknowledged the loss of several men. So, this is our version of what happened. So somewhere in all that lies the truth of what happened, okay? But this fighting, I didn't really want to get into 1776, but this happened so close that I thought I'd mention it. There are going to be much bloodier fighting down the road, including an epic naval fight right off of Block Island coming up in the spring. But that is beyond my purview today because I bet I'm running out of time. And I want to save it, yeah. 50 minutes, 5 minutes over. So that is that's 2/3 of my book on the New England colonies, and I talk about what happened all the way through the summer of 76. But at this point, I'd like to ask if you have any questions or you want me to clarify anything, or yes, sir.
I have a sort of a general question about the first year of the war. There's this theory that the British treated the rebellion as just a bunch of hotheads who got, all they had to do was send a massive force to intimidate us and, come back to being nice, loyal colonists. And in fact, one of the reasons Wallace went into town and wine and dine everybody was to, rally the great mass of, he assumed, majority people who would be loyal subjects
Yeah.
and rally them to overcome these hotheads. And that eventually Wallace and others realized, hey, wait a minute, I guess these guys are serious about independence. And and then, anyway, so the theory is, eventually the British realized that I guess these guys don't want to be with us. Okay, and they're seriously gonna fight us, and it's not worth it because what we really care about are the Caribbean colonies. Right?
Oh, all right. So you're jumping a lot.
And what do you think of that theory?
Well, first, when I reacted, take independence out. I haven't even mentioned it. There's no thought of independence to speak of. Well, there might be now in January, but for most of what I covered, independence is not on the table. It might be in the back of John Adams' mind and others, a few others, but it is not. Let's not talk about we're fighting for independence yet. That comes later. But when we first started speaking, I thought of Major Pitcairn. I forget his first name now, but Major Pitcairn was commander of the British Marines. And in March of 1775, a month before Lexington and Concord, he writes a letter, but basically says, I'm just going to paraphrase it, it says, look, all it's going to take is one strong showing of force, and these guys will quake in their boots. And the mistake that was made is repealing the stamp tax in 1765. When we did that, he says, that gave these rebels, these ungrateful rebels, this idea that they could get away with more if they just whined and complained. Now, Lexington and Concord is going to go a long way to change that. Bunker Hill is going to kill Pitcairn. He dies there. And the British now are beginning to realize, oh my God, these guys can fight. Nobody's thinking of independence, though, at that point. They're still thinking about their English. You guys realize what this is all about, right? For 12 years or so, we've been saying, why are you treating us not like English citizens? We're English subjects. We are English just like you. You would never try to tax us, your own people in England, the way you're doing this to us. That whole no taxation without representation, they meant it. It's a very serious thing to an Englishman. And you see these letters in 65, 66, 67. There's one from George Mason who basically says, we are exactly like you. The only difference between us and you is that we live 3,000 miles across the ocean. But we have the same ideas on government and the same hopes and desires. And why are you doing this to us? Why are you trying to tax us unfairly? Because that's what it comes down to. I tell my kids, I told my students all the time, it's all about being treated unfairly. Take the taxes out of it. The taxes is just one way. It's all about ruling. Are they going to rule us? Is the British Parliament going to rule us when we don't vote for them? Or are we going to maintain our own autonomy, our own, legislatures? And the king, nobody questioned the king until all of a sudden we break away and blame everything on the king. But nobody questioned his right to veto a law in Virginia. He had that right. But Parliament, those are politicians elected by Englishmen, not by us. And there's no way you come up with this idea of, well, we could send representatives over. No, not in the 18th century, because they'd have to live there, they'd be separated from us, and they wouldn't be us anymore. Ben Franklin was over there as an agent, as a representative, but he didn't have any voting power, and he became more English, a Londoner, than he had more in common with London than in Philadelphia when he returned to Philadelphia 25 years later. Other questions? Yeah.
So just to clarify on that, so was the sort of prevailing thought that they still want to be English, but recognizing they can't function within Parliament, they want to have their own sort of representation, but be treated equally by the Crown?
Well, that's what they wanted. You'll see it time and time again. Why can't we go back to 1763? Why can't we go back to the way things were before you started with all these new policies? The Stamp Act being the most notable one, but there were the Sugar Act and things like that. And if we could go back to that time period, we wouldn't have a beef. But then, after 10 years, then 12 years, now we're in 1775, they finally begin to realize they're never going to give us what we want. And so the only way we're going to get those freedoms that we used to have before they change it is to be independent. Now that's a huge step. I don't know, have you guys ever seen the miniseries, the John Adams miniseries? As a teacher, I love to show that vote. When they take the vote and they finally got everybody on the same page, and New York abstains, but the other ones all vote yes, right? And then what happens at the end of that last vote is cast? Silence. Nobody's cheering. Nobody's like, yeah, huzzah. Everybody's just sitting there. I just got to chill because they realized what they'd done. They had separated. And that makes the war very different. There was a rebellion within the country. Now they're foreign countries, you know? And so, and John Dickinson tried to say this, if we do this, we're going to be enemies. You know, we're going to be foreign enemies to them. They're not going to treat us as well as they would if we were brethren. And so it was a big move. And then within 6 months, we're teetering on the edge. We lose New York, we lose most of New Jersey. Washington's army of 20,000 is down to a couple of thousand. Thank God those Virginians are up there. And then he pulls a rabbit out of the hat at Trenton, crosses the Delaware River, and keeps the movement alive, really. It's a big movement there. But again, and Rhode Island troops, I believe, were with him. Yeah, I'm pretty sure Rhode Island troops were at Trenton. But I don't even talk about that in my book, so we won't talk about it here.
Do we know what caused Nathaniel Greene's limp?
You know, I was reading it last night, and it didn't seem to be any sort of injury that happened. One person made an observation that one leg was shorter than the other, or it was just a lameness from. I think the implication was what he did growing up as a boy in the foundry may have created some sort of not a chronic condition, but there's no accident. He didn't break the leg or anything like that once. Yeah, it's quite. We're very, very lucky. Nathaniel Greene, his papers have been published, so you could find them in libraries. We have a great library at Colonial Williamsburg that I get to use, and so I would recommend it. You always go to the source if you can. That's always the best source of information. Other questions? I can hang around if you want to ask, on the side there too. But so the idea tonight was just to show you that there's a lot more going on besides Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill and all that. So I thank you for your time.
Our sponsor, the Battle of Rhode Island Association, has some swag and some books they want to pass along. Unfortunately, we don't have a representative from the organization here.
Oh, well,
so
thank them for me.
On their behalf. So
Nice.
Thank you very much for coming. And,
thank you.
Stick around, ask any questions. We hope to see you at our next talk next month, which is on, I want to say it's November 9th. It's about, oh gosh, I'm blanking.
Thursday, November 6th.
November 6th, thank you. Tara Bynum, and the topic is Black joy, finding Black joy in revolutionary providence. So, thanks again.
This is what